Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Symbiosis, which is episode 21 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the episode Symbiosis. So Symbiosis is the episode where the Enterprise is exploring a new system and they find a freighter that is about to be destroyed. They save this freighter but find that there are two different aliens that live on neighboring planets. One has a disease that is killing them all, and the other has the medicine which could save them, but they refuse to give them this medicine because the aliens had no longer paid for it because all of their payment was destroyed with the freighter. And so a big battle ensues between these two parties where Picard is trying to play mediator, but then Dr. Crusher discovers that it is not a disease at all, that it is an addiction, that the Breckians have addicted the Inarians to a drug where there once was a disease, but it was eliminated 200 years ago, and so they made them drug addicts under false pretenses. So Dr. Crusher urges Picard to intercede, to not let them keep selling drugs, to help to reveal to the Inarians what's really going on, and to help them with treatments that she can give them, which would ease the withdrawal symptoms that they will be experiencing. However, Picard cites the Prime Directive, refuses to take any action to help them. However, that also includes the Onarians wanted them to repair their two only remaining freighters that allow them to trade with the Breckians. However, Picard refuses to do that, which implies that they won't be able to repair the ships themselves, and therefore they won't be able to resume trade with the Breckians anytime soon, meaning that their addiction will be broken by that time. But it's going to happen the old-fashioned way, which Dr. Crusher is not very happy about. But Picard cites the Prime Directive as not being just a set of rules. It is the guiding principle that defines the Federation. Funny thing, though, he didn't have a problem with that in Justice when he broke it just to save Wesley's life. Which is another thing you can talk about. Yeah, let's save one 14-year-old kid, but let's just let an entire world population of millions of people suffer badly, and many of them will probably die in the process because of the Prime Directive. Because, of course, Wesley's awesome. He saves the universe every episode. Anyway, I guess we'll start there since I already brought it up. Very controversial episode. Many Prime Directive episodes are. In fact, yeah, most of the Prime Directive episodes have been disputed and argued against. I definitely feel like, especially more so in later years, I feel like in like the 90s when these episodes first came out, there was some discussion around them, and granted that it wasn't really internet around then, but still I used to read magazines and stuff where there was discourse about Star Trek and you know, read people's opinions. And there wasn't, I don't think it definitely wasn't as contentious as it began in the late 2010s and continued onwards, where there was a growing movement of people who are really against the Prime Directive, or at least how it's applied in certain episodes, this being one of them. Another contentious, probably the most contentious episode is Homeward in season 7. I'll get to that one eventually. And there's also Who Watches the Watchers. I've seen a lot of people criticize the use of the Prime Directive there. Yeah. So here, they're kind of on Dr. Crusher's side. And I don't know, because I usually defend the Prime Directive. I didn't even bring up Dear Doctor. Because here's the thing. This episode is similar to Dear Doctor, which is the Enterprise episode, which I already did a review for, and I really discussed the Prime Directive there and how people inaccurately state that Captain Archer and Dr. Phlox committed genocide when they did no such thing, because they literally did nothing. Doing nothing is not genocide. For example, if the Enterprise never went to that planet, whatever was going to happen would happen anyway. Would happen the same. They literally made no difference whatsoever. And I'm sorry, that's not genocide. And making zero difference whether they met them or not is not genocide. And so it's the same thing with this episode. Whatever happened with the Breckians and the Onarans would have happened anyway had the Enterprise never encountered them. And that's kind of the point of the Prime Directive. And so you can't say, oh, Picard let those people suffer, but if Picard wasn't there, things would have played out exactly the same. So that's not doing something. It's the definition of doing nothing. Like, they had no involvement. They're not causing the suffering. Now here's the thing. I don't actually know, because I defend the Prime Directive a lot, but I don't actually know, like, especially watching this episode again and re-examine it, I don't actually know if I agree completely with Picard's decision here, because would it really, like, okay, so his argument is whenever a superior civilization interferes with one less developed, no matter how good the intentions, it always leads to disaster. Now, the Prime Directive sometimes can be a bit undefined, because the Prime Directive says that the Federation can't make contact or have any sort of contact or relations with pre-warp civilizations. But once they have warp drive, which I don't know if it's established that these races have warp drive because they're only traveling within the solar system, but they do have complex technology, including a transporter. And it's funny, I also thought that was funny how Yar says, go to your transporter. How do you know they have a transporter technology? But apparently they do. So they're somewhat advanced, so we can assume that they are warp capable. So the Federation is allowed to make contact with them, but they're not allowed to interfere in the natural internal politics or process of their society. Like, it's the same with, like, say, the Klingons, which are highly advanced, arguably just as advanced as the Federation, yet when there was a Klingon civil war going on, the Federation, admirals cited the Prime Directive as don't interfere with it. And same with the Bajorans, when the Cardassians went to take them over again, the Federation admirals like, oh, this has nothing to do with Starfleet, so you can't interfere. And so it seems like it's that part of the Prime Directive that's being applied to this episode, but it's a bit iffy for me, because you know how I just said if Picard and the Enterprise never showed up, things would have turned out exactly the same. Well, that's not exactly accurate, because that freighter would have been destroyed. So those 4 people who are now still alive would be dead. And so who knows what those 4 people do. Maybe one become a tyrant and kill millions of people. Or maybe one will, like, save the universe or whatever. And that wouldn't have happened had the Enterprise not interfered by saving their lives. So isn't that also... I don't know. This is where it gets a bit murky, because the pre-warp civilizations is very clear. You have no contact, you have no interference, you have no interaction. Therefore, you cannot affect the natural development. But I think it's more murky for the races that are warp capable. They say, oh, it's okay to have contact with them. You just can't interfere with the internal politics or internal society or whatever. But just by having contact, you're interfering. As I said, like those 4 people would be dead, and who knows what impact they will have on our Beccan society. And also, that shipment of Felicium would have been destroyed, and instead it was delivered to Onar, prolonging their addiction a bit. And so I don't, if they can interfere, and that is interference, if they can interfere in that regard, why is Picard so incredibly opposed to taking the one extra step of letting them know that they're drug addicts and giving them treatment to ease their suffering? So, tons of people don't die, because tons of people probably died. Withdrawals are fucking tough. Some people can die just from the withdrawals, not to mention the insanity, maybe violence that was caused due to this, withdrawals on a worldwide scale. I mean, that's horrific to think about. And they could have eased it and made it easier, but Picard was like so, preaching, no, the Prime Directive isn't just a set of rules, it's a principle, but you already saved their lives. And in fact, Picard was willing to give them the parts necessary to repair their ships. He, at first, and at the start of the episode, he's like, yeah, sure, we'll repair your ships. He didn't seem to have any care about the Prime Directive in that regard, but then later, once he realized what was going on with the drugs, he's like, okay, I'm going to be very strict about the Prime Directive and not give you this stuff to repair your ships. But like, I don't know, the line seems blurry to me, where Picard is drawing the line with the Prime Directive. And as I said, like, he had no compunction about violating it in the episode Justice, which was just to save one boy's life. So I can see why a lot of people disagree with Picard's decision here, and how he's on murky ground. But ultimately, I still believe in the Prime Directive. I just think, I don't know. I think that Picard there would have been nothing wrong with him easing the withdrawal symptoms. Now, granted, had he revealed to the Anarians that the Breckians are exploiting them with narcotics, honestly, I think the Anarians' first reaction would be to not believe that. But assuming they did eventually, that would be a massive, massive, massive change to the society. Now, granted, they're going to figure it out themselves, you would think, once they, go through the withdrawal and they survive the withdrawal symptoms and find that they've been cured. One would think someone would put 2 and 2 together and figure out what had been going on. So they would have found out anyway, but I think it would have made a difference if Picard told them, because they would have found out sooner. It would have affected how they viewed the Federation. I don't know. It would have been somewhat interfering, but I still think using the treatments to ease their withdrawal symptoms would have been worth it. And I do think it would have been, if Picard can violate the Prime Directive to save Wesley's life, why not violate it to ease the suffering? Especially, as I said, he's already interfering just by saving those people's lives. And here's a question I have. Why do the Breckians beam down to Anara with the Anarians? Because they don't have any ships. How are they going to get back to Brekka? Maybe, they said maybe the other ships could be repaired. But, and that's the other thing. Even with Picard doing nothing, maybe they repair the ships on their own. Like, you think the Breckians are, like, super rich. Might be able to, repair the ships for them. Um, but no, they could have fixed it themselves, and then the exploitation would have continued. So, but we have the episode in Lower Decks, so I want to talk about this. I gotta talk about this. Last year, I believe it was, that had a Lower Decks episode that followed up on whatever happened to Symbiosis. Now, Lower Decks is Lower Decks. It's a comedy show. I think it is technically canon, but it's a bit, some things are definitely not. Some things are definitely done for very comedic effect and are just silly. Like, for example, it's not canon that Q runs around playing with chess with junior officers on random starships. I don't know, maybe he does, but so take it for what you will. But Lower Decks had a follow up to this, where they went to Inara and they found that Picard did the right thing and the civilization's okay, and that they're all survived it and they're a healthy society now, and they actually revere the Enterprise interference as, I don't know, because the episode gives Enterprise the credit for taking away their drugs, but they didn't really. As I said, they did nothing. They would have lost the drugs regardless. So I think that's kind of inaccurate. But anyway, it's funny. I was reading a Memory Alpha article in this episode, and I had this entry, which I think the person who wrote it was kind of biased, because they were describing Lower Decks as vindicating that Picard did the wrong thing because the Inarians suffered terribly. But that's not what the Lower Decks said. Lower Decks actually says Picard did the right thing, because even though they did suffer terribly and they had this mural where they were all going crazy and killing each other, they came through it on the other side and became a better society, and they all became a bunch of health nuts. And again, this is where you got to take Lower Deck as a comedic thing in the stride. So they actually came out better for it. So I think the episode's clearly saying Picard did the right thing and was vindicating him. And then apparently Brekka was conquered and invaded by the Breen, which is very random, and I don't really get that, why the Breen, because Brekka would have, I don't like how they just did that Breen storyline, because I actually wanted to see Brekka swag, because their one industry was the narcotics, and once they lost that, it would have been interesting to see a more sort of level-headed view of their planet, of them being all in poverty and their industry collapsing and stuff like that because of that. But no, we just got the Breen attack. Now, I want to make the analogy to, because this episode's clearly about drugs, and even though, I'll get to the PSA with Tasha Yar in a bit, but even though that kind of implies it's more about, heroin, crystal meth and stuff like that, I think the better comparison would be opioids, painkillers. Because I'm thinking of that show on Hulu that I watched about the opioid crisis in the 90s, and called Dope Sick with Michael Keaton. I loved it. It was my favorite show of that year. I think it was an amazing show that just showed the corporation that was it Purdue, I think, that was manufacturing Oxycontin and treating it like it could treat minor pain, like it was no big deal, and they specifically said it was non-addictive, when in fact it was extremely addictive, and it caused a lot of addicts, a lot of suffering, and a lot of people would turn to heroin after starting that. And they were marketing as if it was just like Tylenol or something, when it was actually a highly addictive narcotic. And they profited off of it, and they made tons of money. They showed all the salesmen who made tons of money. The CEO became like filthy rich, and they were billionaires and all this. That reminds me of the Breckons. So this is where I draw the comparison. I think comes better than saying like something like heroin, or you could try to, or cocaine. You could try to make the analogy to like drug cartels or like Pablo Escobar in the 80s, and maybe that's what the thought of this was, because the thing I'm citing with the opioid crisis in Purdue happened after this episode was made, and I am aware of that. Don't think I'm not aware of that. I am aware that that was not the intention to make a commentary on that, because it hadn't even happened yet. So maybe the intention was to compare him more to like Pablo Escobar or some of these cartels or whatever. But the way I look at it, since it was legal, since the Breckians weren't criminals, and their legal system involving the two worlds, they were legitimate businessmen, and that's how they describe themselves. I would draw the comparison more to stuff like Purdue or other drug companies that sold these opioids that caused a lot of addiction and a lot of death while they profit off of it, and they didn't care. And especially watch the show Dope Sick. It's so good. It really gets into how they were fighting the law and skirting the law and lying in order to keep getting away with all this to really sell this drug, which they were making millions of dollars off, but addicted tons of people. Lives were destroyed by this drug. And so I think the analogy with the Breckians, I would compare them to Purdue much more than I would to Pablo Escobar. Because they see themselves as just legitimate business people, and they skirt the laws and the government in order to do it legally and to profit off of the misery and suffering and the addiction of millions of people. So that is definitely... and plus, the Felicium was marketed as a drug, as the medicine, as that's what the Anarians thought. They thought it was a medicine that was helping them, just like the painkillers or medicine that's helping you relieve the pain. Now, of course, I myself has taken some of these painkillers when I had surgery, kidney stones and stuff like that. So it does have its purpose, and I'm not saying it doesn't. But the problem with Purdue, and if you watch the show, it really gets into it, is that they were marketing it as if it wasn't that big of a deal, as if it wasn't hugely addictive, and as if it wasn't something you need to be very, very fucking careful with. And that's where the issues coming in, and that's what made them an evil corporation that was profiting off of suffering of millions of others. But anyway, enough current politics. And as I say, I am aware that this episode was not intending to because that all stuff happened afterwards. But anyway, I'm sure there were still some opioid issues even in the 80s. But in the 80s, the big thing was, illicit drugs, cocaine and heroin and whatnot. So let's get into the PSA. Hey, kids, don't do drugs. Now, a lot of people really hyper-focus on this scene, I think. A lot of times where this episode is mentioned, that's the one where Tasha Yar said, hey, kids, don't do drugs. And they really hyper-focus on this scene. And to be fair, it is kind of a bad scene. And it is a bit silly. And it is a bit obviously kind of a PSA, which was very common in the 80s, mind you, especially the late 80s. But I don't think I don't hyper focus on it. I don't think it ruins the whole episode. I don't focus on it. It's just one scene that's kind of dumb and cheesy. But the rest of the episode's very, very interesting, so I don't let this one little scene interfere. But it is kind of silly because Wesley starts out the conversation with, "Oh, I know the Inarians weren't aware that they didn't voluntarily become drug addicts, but some people do voluntarily become drug addicts. Why would they do this?" So right there, they're starting off with, well, this actually has nothing to do with the episode, but it makes me think about drugs. So why do people take drugs, which actually isn't related to what's going on in the episode, which is probably my biggest issue with this scene, is that it's unrelated to the episode, because the episode is about one society exploiting another society by lying to them and enslaving them to addiction. That's not the same as people who voluntarily take heroin and get addicted to it. It's just loosely related because it's both about drugs. And so that's why I hate the scene the most. But I actually don't think the PSA is that cheesy, or more to the point, that inaccurate. Because the way that Yar and the others, especially Yar, describes drugs, I think is very true of really hard drugs like heroin. Now, I remember when I was a teenager in high school, there was a friend. I had seen this episode already a whole bunch of times, but there was someone I went to school with who was a big pothead, who watched this episode for the first time, and the next day he was going on and on about how silly that was, and why do people like, hey kids, don't do drugs, and drugs make you feel good. But the thing is like that, what Yar is talking about very clearly and obviously does not apply to drugs like marijuana or alcohol or caffeine. Well, it could apply to alcohol, actually, but definitely not marijuana. Alcohol is definitely more dangerous than caffeine. Than marijuana. Caffeine's more dangerous than people give it credit for. But anyway, yes, but if you apply it to really, really hard drugs like heroin and crystal meth, which are drugs that I'm not going to get into my whole history of what I did, but I always avoided drugs like that, like the plague. Like that was like a big no. Why the fuck would you do this? And I had a friend once who thought about trying heroin. I'm like, why the fuck would you do that, you idiot? Don't. And most people I knew felt the same way about those hard drugs like that. It's like, no, I'm staying the fuck away from them. Pot and stuff like that is fine, but but that doesn't even compare to the harder stuff, heroin, crystal meth. And so when I look at her speech that way, that it applies only for those hard drugs. And how she described them was, they don't take them expecting to be addicted. They don't know that they're going to be addicted, but they take it just because they want to feel good and they want to escape the miseries of their lives. And she mentioned a lot of impoverished areas were in the world that she grew up on. They turned to drugs, which is also very true. A lot of impoverished areas and people who have rough lives tend to get hooked on drugs, and at first they take it to feel good, but then eventually it becomes to the point where they're taking it not to feel bad, and that, I think, is actually a pretty good way to describe addiction, and actually would work for opioids as well. So I don't have that big of an issue with this scene. But I definitely don't like it and think it was unnecessary. So another thing I've seen some people complain about with this episode is the start of the episode where Picard is trying to save the freighter, and you have the Onarian captain who is being really like silly, like stupid. He's being like, I don't actually have an issue with this. In fact, I kind of think it's funny. I kind of like it. And more to the point, I think it's good foreshadowing. These are addicts, by the way, who are... Now, it might be a bit cliche in that regard because it's acting maybe a bit too much like he's on drugs. Like, oh, great, he can save the ship. It's like... Does anyone over there know how to repair install this device? He's like, oh, give me a second, let me ask. And I love how Picard does his face palm, which I guess is not that memeable because usually the memes do face palms from different episodes, but that was actually a really classic face palm. Like, oh Jesus Christ, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? I think it added to the mystery of the episode. And as I said, I think it was a good setup and it was funny. And it was very intriguing how they beamed, when they went to save them, they beamed the cargo aboard first. And they were like, what? Everyone in the Enterprise like, what the fuck? Like, the ship is about to destroy. Why the fuck are they beaming their cargo? And then they beam 4 out of 6 people, so 2 people died in Riker's first saw. I'm sorry we couldn't save the other 2 people, but if you would come first, not your cargo, and their reactions would go like, what about the cargo? Where's the cargo? I want the cargo. Not giving a shit about the 2 people that just died. And again, that's very sort of consistent with how being addicted and whatnot. Now, I must assume the 2 people who died were Narians, because you think if they were Breckons, the Breckons there who aren't addicted would care that their companions died, but I don't know, maybe not. They're cold-hearted. But yeah, the Breckons were definitely portrayed, even though this is Purdue opioid crisis, whatever, there were definitely, I think the inspiration was big corporate millionaire hotshots who profit off of the suffering of others. That was definitely the vibes I'm getting from this. And I loved how Crusher instantly despised them. And she would even be nasty and snap at them when they were spoken in sickbay. So that was cool. And then of course I also have to mention that there's 2 actors who appeared in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. The first time I ever saw this episode, I think I was started halfway through, so I didn't really understand what was going on. I'm like, hey, those are 2 actors from The Wrath of Khan. What are they doing here? So it's the guy who played David, Kirk's son, and also the guy who played Joachim, Khan's number 1, for lack of a better term. So yeah, and so I instantly recognized them. And it kind of threw me off a bit because it was why there's Star Trek 2 guys here? But eventually, I got used to this episode and I got used to them being there. But yeah, they do a good job in this episode. But it's interesting how they chose 2 different Star Trek 2 actors to be in the exact same episode. I don't know if that was intentional, thought-provoking, or whatever. But anyway, you gotta talk about the wave. I'll mention the wave. Everybody knows about the wave. So this was the last episode that Denise Crosby filmed for Next Generation, because it was filmed after Skin of Evil for whatever reason, I don't know. So in the last scene she appears in, which is a scene with Crusher and Picard leaving the cargo bay, and I probably wouldn't have been able to figure this out myself if someone hadn't told me, but if you look as Picard and Crusher walking out of the cargo bay, Tashiar waves, and it was supposed to be Denise Crosby waving goodbye. And I recently watched a podcast where she described the events, and she said that someone said, oh, let's just do it as a blooper, and she never thought they would actually keep it in the episode, and apparently they did. And she, to this day, doesn't know if they intentionally did that because they wanted to wave in, or if that that was just the best take or the only take they had. Maybe they didn't even notice. But you'd think an editor who stares at this footage over and over again would notice something like that. But anyway, maybe not. I don't know. So yeah, I think I covered all of my bases with this episode. Yeah, it was very sort of thought-provoking, I think. So now, let me thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It is extremely appreciated. It does really help me continue with the channel, and yes, I just can't say how much I appreciate it. So, the supporters are Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Gamigula, Cio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neil Howes. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So, we have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who simply states a quote and cites who quoted it. So it is, drugs make you feel good. Tasha Yar. Lieutenant Tasha Yar. Indeed, getting into the whole PSA, and plus that's a nice little snippet to take it out of context. Anyway, next comment is from Greg Marley. He says, it's rare to see the main characters expressing the petty irritation we all sometimes feel in everyday life. So it's funny in the beginning of the episodes to see Picard's exasperation at the other captain's fuzzy-minded incompetence. Picard actually mutters, "What is the matter with these people?" and practically smacks his forehead at one point. And then Tasha and Riker in the transporter room also get frustrated with having to keep explaining things to these dumb asses. Then at the end, when given the order to leave orbit, Picard sort of rolls his eyes and says, let's just get out of here. I don't care where. This is the episode where Tasha gives her little anti-drug speech to Wesley, which apparently really irked a lot of people. It's corny, but never really bothered me that much. I like how Picard, despite hardly knowing these aliens, felt confident enough to brazen it out and bluff them when Riker's life is in the balance, when the guy is holding him in that frozen position, basically saying, nah, you're not going to kill him. I'm not giving in. I'm sure Riker appreciated that. All in all, a fairly solid episode, I would say, for the first season, presenting the crew with a pretty dark and cynical situation that forces Picard to come up with a very roundabout way of helping the victimized aliens without violating the Prime Directive. Picard's little talk with Beverly in the end about what the Prime Directive demands is pretty interesting. So yeah, the thing with the alien holding Riker with his electro-charged thingy, which seemed kind of like an afterthought, wasn't really that important for the plot, but it was just a detail they threw in, so I don't have an issue with it. But anyway, him threatening to kill Riker, I don't think Picard was bluffing. I think what Picard said to him was, you're not going to kill him, you're not a murderer. And I think that wasn't a bluff as much as a character read. Like, he knew that, and he was correct. He knew that the guy was not a murderer, that he was just going through withdrawals and doing crazy things, and knew that he wouldn't kill Riker. So I think I see that more as Picard knew that he was. I guess you could say he was gambling on the fact that he was right and that the guy wouldn't kill Riker. But it's Picard, of course he's fucking right. But But it's interesting how Riker was like almost got killed by them, yet he was willing to stay behind and stay with them after Beverly and Picard left. I would have been like, maybe I'll just go into another room. Maybe you should get checked out in sick bay. Just a thought. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, in my humble opinion, this is the best episode of the first season of TNG. To me, it felt like a darker and rich dynamic storytelling compared to the rest of the crap in this season. I really liked the moral dilemma behind this. I thought the alien culture was fascinating. This is a good commentary on drug abuse, and I really liked it. My rating is a 9 out of 10. That's pretty damn positive on this episode. Next comment is from Maddie Jester, who says, another good episode, this one. I don't say that much in season 1. A lot of people rolled their eyes at the don't do drugs Wesley scene, but plenty of TV shows of that era had something similar, especially ones that kids may watch. I think it's fine. Some decent guest stars and a nice Wrath of Khan reunion. It's a shame Merritt Buttrick passed away young. He turned in some good performances. Was Picard right in the end? I'd say yes. It is good that the Anarians got over their addiction and took up fitness. Unlucky for the Breckians, though. They ended up with the Breen. Ha! 8 out of 10 from me. Yeah, so Merritt Buttrick, who was the actor who played the Anarian, and he played David in The Wrath of Khan, actually died of AIDS in '89, so that would have been a year after this episode was filmed, which is quite tragic, indeed. But the other actor who played Joachim, who appeared in this episode, actually later also appeared on Voyager. Anyway, Picard, I don't know. I side more with Picard, but I do wonder if giving them the things that ease the symptoms, would it really have hurt that much? I don't know. Anyway, I got one last comment. This comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, this episode is stupid. First, you have the planet of hillbilly junkies who don't know how to fly, much less repair their 2 or 3 aging spaceships. Then you have a planet of drug manufacturers, and making and supplying that drug is their only economic achievement. I just don't think it would be sustainable, certainly not for 2 centuries, so I cannot take this episode seriously. Riker and Yar running down the corridor discussing the hillbilly junkies' zap powers is probably the most interaction the 2 characters have had in the entire series. Even Picard is disgusted and finds a way to weasel out of the whole situation. 3, Wesley Crusher's saying wow in a really unconvincing way out of 10. As always, Brandon, always respect your opinion, even though I don't agree with it in this particular case, as I actually really liked this episode. But you do make a point about, I also found it a bit unbelievable that manufacturing narcotics was the only industry that the entire world had. And their excuse was, well, the Anarians furnish us with all the goods that we need. And we're talking about an entire world. You're going to have more industries than just making drugs. Maybe that's their main one. That's fine if they could say it's a huge one that drives the economy, and if it collapses, the economy collapses. Okay, I buy that, but that's not what you said. You said it's the only industry, which is bullshit. But I'm more willing to, roll with the punches with that one as being inaccurate sort of writing where they didn't really express it what they actually meant. So in other words, it doesn't bother me as much. But Anyway, my rating for Symbiosis out of 10 is going to be an 8, extremely good. So I am not quite as high as Ricky was, but certainly higher than Brandon was. I do think that this was definitively my favorite episode of season 1. I still have a few episodes left, but from what I remember of those episodes, yeah, I'm pretty confident in saying this is my favorite episode of season 1. Not that it's a big achievement, since season 1 is overall a bad season, but for example, this episode would not make any top. I don't think it made my top 30. I don't think it would even make my top 50. It could, I don't know, but not my top 30. So not that this was an amazing episode or anything like that, but out of the pool, the cesspool that is season 1, I do think this is the best because it's very fascinating. I think, and most of all, like, the reception to this episode seems to be really mixed, really sort of lukewarm, I would say, where people are like, it's fine, seems to be the consensus, where I think, no, this is more than fine. I think whether you agree with Picard's decision or not, and as I said, I myself might be a bit iffy on it, it's great. Moral dilemma. It's a great, thinker. It's a very interesting concept of an entire society being dependent on drugs and another society being the drug dealers that are hooked on drugs. I think it's a very fascinating concept, and as I said, it has real world analogies that occurred after this episode was made. So, that shows when that happens in Star Trek. I realize that's what makes it such a timely and sort of well thought out commentary, when the commentary becomes necessary even after it was made. This happened with A Taste of Armageddon in the original series, where one would argue the commentary was even more relevant after 50 or so years after that episode was made. And I would even say episodes like The Drumhead came very relevant and during the era of 9/11, which is after it was made. And also, speaking of 9/11, there's the Deep Space Nine two-parter, Homefront and Paradise Lost, which is almost like, if it came out after 9/11, it would be described as too on the nose, too obvious a 9/11 analogy, except for the fact it was made before 9/11, or at least it was more about the aftermath and hysteria that resulted from 9/11 rather than 9/11 itself. But yeah, I would put this episode in that same category as being more relevant for the opioid crisis and other things that would happen later, which I think is more relevant to the cocaine or heroin and crisis of the 80s, personally. But anyway, that is it for my review of Symbiosis. I shall be back with more Star Trek reviews, so let me just bring up the schedule here. So Wednesday, I'll be covering the season finale of Ahsoka, which I'm sure is going to be awesome, but very sad that show is ending because it's so damn good. And then Thursday, the next episode of Lower Decks I shall be covering. And then Saturday, Tasha Yar's Big Farewell, Skin of Evil. We'll do my review for that. And then Monday, we'll be back with another TNG review with We'll Always Have Paris. Not to be confused with We'll Always Have Tom Paris, which is a Lower Decks episode. Anyway, be sure to check out my channel for all of that, as I cover many more Star Trek videos and many videos on many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.